I bought an old one could locate. The county had been sitting on it for 2 years. The minimum bid was $100, and on the morning of the auction, I was the only bidder. I drove out to see it that same afternoon. It was October, and the maples along Dunor Street were burning orange and red, which was the only beautiful thing I could say about the situation. The house itself was a disaster. The porch railing had rotted clean through. One of the front windows was boarded over with plywood that had started to warp. The yard was a tangle of dead weeds and volunteer sumac that had grown shoulder high against the foundation. But the bones were good. I could see it the way you can see potential in a person who's been through something hard. The roof line was straight. The chimney was intact. The porch columns were original and solid. I walked through every room with a flashlight and a notepad. And by the time I came back outside into the cold October air, I had already decided I would fix it myself. I had done enough renovation work through the business to know what I was doing. I would live in it while I worked. I would sell it when it was done. The first weeks were exactly what I expected. Exhausting, dirty, and deeply unglamorous. I tore out the bathroom tile and discovered soft subfloor. I pulled the kitchen cabinets and found a layer of wallpaper under the drywall and under that original beadboard in near perfect condition. I replaced the porch railing, reglazed 2 windows, and spent an entire weekend cleaning a century's worth of debris from the basement. It was in the 3rd week that I first noticed something was off. I was working on the dining room wall, the long interior wall that ran parallel to the hallway, when I tap it with my knuckle the way I always do, testing for hollow spots that might indicate water damage or a failing stud. The left side of the wall sounded the way it was supposed to. The right side did too. But there was a section in the middle, roughly 4 feet wide, that sounded different. Not hollow exactly, more like there was something behind it. Something insulated, something that had been deliberately packed in. I told myself it was probably just extra insulation added at some point. Old houses were full of quirks. People did strange things to old houses. I told myself that for 3 more days. Then I got out my stud finder, ran it slowly across that section of wall, and watched the readings jump in a way that didn't match insulation. It matched density. Solid, even density, broken up by a seam approximately 6 feet tall and 2 feet wide on the left side, a door-shaped seam. I went back to my truck and sat in the cold for a long time, looking at the house through the windshield. The maple in the front yard had dropped most of its leaves by then. They were plastered wet against the porch steps. What was behind that wall? Part of me didn't want to know. That's the honest answer. Because some part of me understood in that particular way. Your gut understands things before your brain does that. Whatever was back there was going to change things. And I had already been through so many things changing. But I went back inside. I picked up my pry bar, I found the seam, and I opened the wall. The room behind it was small, maybe 8 feet by 6. It smelled of cedar and something metallic like old coins. There was a single bare bulb overhead connected to a wire that ran back into the house's electrical system, which meant someone had wired this deliberately. The floor was concrete, swept clean, and stacked against the far wall in 12 identical black duffel bags was more money than I had ever seen in my life. I didn't count it that night. I couldn't. I sat on the floor of that little room with my back against the door frame and my heart going at a pace that wasn't healthy. And I stared at the bags. It was only when I finally made myself stand up, made myself breathe, made myself look around the room again, that I saw the envelope. It was on a small wooden shelf mounted to the right-hand wall at eye level. A plain white envelope sealed with wax, with nothing written on the outside. My name was not on it. There was no name at all. My hands were shaking when I broke the seal. Inside was a single card. On the card, in neat, careful handwriting, was one word, run. I didn't run. I want to be clear about that, because in the days that followed, I would ask myself 100 times why I didn't. The answer I always came back to was the same. Running requires knowing what you're running from. And I didn't know anything yet. What I had was a room full of money. A word written on a card and a house I had legally purchased for $100. Running felt like surrendering something I hadn't even had the chance to understand yet. But I didn't sleep that night either. I locked the wall back up as best I could, pressing the cut section back into place, propping it with a length of 2x4. And then I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee I didn't drink and watched the window lighten from black to gray to the cold flat white of a November morning. I went through everything I knew about Gerald Foss, which was almost nothing. He had died in 2019. He had lived alone in this house for at least the last 20 years. He had no heirs the county could find. That was the complete inventory of facts I possessed about the man whose house I was living in. What I did the next morning was drive to the Millhaven Public Library. Not the county courthouse, not a lawyer's office, the library. Because I wasn't ready to be official about anything yet. I needed to think before I acted, and thinking required information. The librarian, a small, precise woman named Mrs. Garvey, helped me pull the local newspaper archive without asking a single intrusive question, which I appreciated more than I could say. I spent 4 hours at a microfiche reader going back through 15 years of the Millhaven Courier. Gerald Foss appeared in the paper exactly twice. Once in 2003 in a brief mention in a county planning commission notice about a zoning variance for a property on Route 9. A property listed under a shell company called Foss Land Holdings. And once in 2017 an obituary for a man named Douglas Crane, who is described as a longtime resident of Millhaven and a former business partner of Gerald Foss. Douglas Crane. I wrote the name down. I also wrote down the name of the attorney listed in the zoning notice, Martin Hale of Hale and Associates, with an address in Grayfield, the county seat. I drove home in the dark and sat in the driveway for a while before going inside. The house looked different to me now, not threatening exactly, but weighted like a person who is keeping a secret and can't quite hide the fact that they're doing it. The next morning, I counted the money. It took me most of the day. I was careful and methodical about it, the way I am careful and methodical about everything I do when I'm frightened. Because precision is the closest thing I know to control. I unzipped each bag and stacked the bills on the kitchen table in denominations and counted each stack twice. When I finished, the total was $3,100,000. I sat with that number for a long time. $3. 1 million in a hidden room in a house I had bought for $100 from a dead man, with no heirs from a county, that had no idea what was inside. Legally, the situation was murky in a way that I understood, was going to require very careful navigation. The house was mine. What was inside the house was also arguably mine. But that argument depended on where the money came from and how it had gotten there, and whether anyone with a legal claim to it was still alive to make that claim. The envelope said run, which meant someone had put that money there deliberately, which meant someone had known at some point that someone else might find it, which meant the money had a history, and histories, in my experience, have people attached to them. The question was, who? I knew I needed a lawyer, not the one named Martin Hale. He had a connection to Foss, and I wasn't going near anyone with a prior connection to this house until I understood what I was dealing with. I needed someone outside the county, someone I could trust. I also knew I needed to be careful about what I said and to whom and for how long, because the moment I told anyone, a lawyer, a friend, my mother, anyone, this became real in a way that couldn't be undone, and I needed to be ready for that. So I gave myself 3 days. 3 days to research, to think, and to build a plan before I made a single official move. The plan that took shape was not complicated. It had 3 parts. First, establish a clear legal record of the discovery. Date, location, documented inventory in a way that protected me and created an unambiguous timeline. Second, research the money's origin well enough to anticipate who might come looking for it and why. Third, consult a lawyer who specialized in found property and estate law outside of this county before I said a word to anyone in an official capacity in Millhaven. What I didn't account for in those 3 quiet days of planning was that someone was already watching the house. I didn't know that yet, but I would. The lawyer I found was named Patricia Okafor. She practiced out of a small firm in Westerville, specializing in estate disputes, probate complications, and what her website called property law for non-standard situations. I like that phrase. My situation was non-standard in ways that I suspected would take a while to fully enumerate. I called her on a Thursday morning from my truck, parked 2 blocks from the house, because I had begun to feel irrationally. I told myself that the walls of the house were listening. I told her everything. I told her about the auction, the purchase price, the hidden room, the money, and the envelope with a single word. I spoke for 20 minutes without stopping. When I finished, there was a pause on the other end. "Are you safe?" she asked. That was not the question I expected. "I think so," I said. "Okay," she said. "Don't move the money. Don't tell anyone else. Come see me tomorrow." Patricia Okafor was a compact woman in her late 40s with a reputation, I would later learn, for being the person other lawyers sent cases to when those cases were too complicated or too sensitive for them to want to touch. She listened to me tell the story again in her office, this time taking notes, and at the end she leaned back in her chair and looked at me with an expression. And I recognized the expression of someone doing rapid triage. "Here's what you need to understand," she said. "The legal status of this money is genuinely uncertain. Because you purchased the property through a legitimate tax lien auction, you have a strong argument for ownership of its contents. But if the money was obtained illegally, if it was the proceeds of a crime, that complicates things significantly. The government can make a claim. So, can any victims of whatever activity generated it And if it was just saved, hidden legitimately, then it's almost certainly yours. But you'll need to be able to demonstrate that, or at minimum demonstrate that no one with a valid claim can be identified. She advised me to file a formal report with the county sheriff's office documenting the discovery and to do it immediately, not because I was legally required to in this precise circumstance, but because creating an official time-stamped record of the discovery was the single best protection I had. If anyone ever claims you found this money and hid it, you want a paper trail showing you went to the authorities the moment you had a plan. I filed the report that same afternoon at the Millhaven County Sheriff's Office. The deputy who took my statement was young and visibly unsure what to do with what I was telling him. He made a phone call, then another. Within an hour, I was sitting across from Sheriff Dale Pute, a heavy man in his mid-50s, with a measured quality to his attention that I found oddly reassuring. He took the report seriously. He sent a deputy back to the house with me. He documented the room, photographed the bags, and logged the serial numbers on a sample of the bills. And then he said something that stopped the blood in my veins. You know what's interesting? He said, standing in the little cedar-smelling room, looking at the stacked bags. We had a report filed on this address back in 2018. Someone didn't leave a name, called in a tip that there was a large sum of money being stored here. We followed up, found nothing, closed it out. He paused. Looks like we missed something. Someone had called in a tip in 2018, a year before Gerald Foss died, which meant that someone, not Foss, not a stranger, but someone who knew, had tried to have the money found or confiscated or removed from Foss's possession, and it hadn't worked. Who would do that? I drove home that night with the windows down, even though it was cold, because I needed the air on my face to stay clear-headed. I was still sitting in the driveway when my phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize. We know you found it. Don't do anything stupid. I screenshot it, forwarded it to Patricia, and called Sheriff. The next morning, Patricia called me with news. She had a contact at the county recorder's office, and she'd pulled the full chain of title on the Fossland Holdings Shell Company from the zoning notice I'd found. The company had been registered in 2001, and it had two members, Gerald Foss and a man named Raymond Crane, the son of Douglas Crane, the man whose obituary had mentioned Foss as a former business partner. I had my first direct connection. I had my first real piece of evidence, and someone out there knew I had it. There was no going back now. Patricia moved quickly once we had Raymond Crane's name. She filed an emergency injunction the following morning, requesting that the money be held under court supervision pending resolution of the ownership claim, and simultaneously notified the county prosecutor's office of the threatening text message. The prosecutor's office was interested. The text had been sent from a burner phone, which told us something about the person who sent it. They had prepared for this, or something like it. This was not a panicked response. This was someone who had been watching and waiting and had a protocol ready. I spent those days at Patricia's office or at a motel outside Columbus where I was staying, not the house. Patricia had advised me to leave Dunor Street until we had a better sense of who we were dealing with, and I had agreed without argument. I was not reckless. I was scared, and I was precise. Raymond Crane was 47 years old, a commercial real estate developer based in Greyfield. Patricia's research turned up a civil judgment against him from 2005 with there. A contractor dispute settled out of court, and a pattern of shell company registrations and dissolutions that suggested to people who knew what they were looking at someone who was very comfortable with the architecture of obscured ownership. He also had a lawyer. His name was Martin Hale. The same Martin Hale who had appeared in the 2003 zoning notice connected to Foss Land Holdings. The same Martin Hale I had instinctively decided not to contact in the first days after the discovery. My instincts, it turned out, had been good. Patricia laid it out for me one afternoon over coffee in her office conference room. Our working theory, she said, and I want to be clear, this is a theory, is that Foss and Crane ran a business together that generated cash. We don't know the nature of the business yet, but the cash storage suggests something that couldn't be easily deposited. When Crane Sr. died in 2017, Raymond as heir would have expected to inherit his father's share of whatever arrangement they had. If Foss stonewalled him, refused to acknowledge the arrangement or hand over any funds, Raymond would have been stuck. You can't file a lawsuit claiming money you can't legally explain. So he called in the anonymous tip in 2018. I said maybe trying to trigger a police seizure, after which he could potentially make a claim as an interested party. But the search didn't find anything. Foss must have sealed the room. Well, and then Foss died in 2019. The property went into limbo, and Raymond was left waiting for an opportunity. He was waiting to buy it himself. That would be my guess. And then you showed up at the auction. I thought about that for a moment. A man who had been waiting years for a chance to get his hands on that money, watching a stranger walk in and take the house for $100. That evening, my phone rang. Unknown number. I answered because Patricia had told me to document every contact. The voice on the other end was smooth and deliberate. The voice of a man who chose his words carefully. Miss Mercer, he said, my name is Raymond Crane. I think we should talk. I said nothing. That money belonged to my father's business partner. He said there's a legal agreement, a private agreement, that entitles my family to half. I'm not asking for anything that isn't mine. I'm asking you to be reasonable. Call my attorney, I said, and I hung up. I forwarded the recording. I had been recording every call since the text to Patricia. And then I sat on the edge of the motel bed and let myself shake for exactly 5 minutes. That was the deal I'd made with myself. 5 minutes of fear and then back to work. Patricia called back within the hour. He'll escalate, she said. He has no legitimate legal claim that he can bring into a courtroom without exposing himself, which means he's going to try other methods. Be ready. She was right. 3 days later, I came back to the house to collect more of my tools and found the rear door standing open. Not